The United States has just crossed a dangerous red line. For the first time in modern history, America's national debt has hit 100% of GDP, meaning we owe as much money as our entire economy produces in a year. But here's what should really terrify you. According to a major fiscal watchdog, this isn't just a big number anymore. We're now on a trajectory toward what they're calling an almost inevitable crisis, and they've identified 6 different ways this could explode. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget just released a chilling report titled, "What Would a Fiscal Crisis Look Like?" And the scenarios they've outlined could fundamentally change life as we know it in America. Today, we're breaking down exactly what's happening, why experts are sounding the alarm, and what 6 types of crises could be heading our way. Let's start with the numbers, because they're staggering. The U.S. national debt has now reached approximately $38 trillion. To put that in perspective, that's roughly $100,000 for every single American citizen. But the real concern isn't just the size, it's the trajectory. The debt is now growing faster than the economy itself, and we've hit that critical 100% debt to GDP ratio. What does that mean? Imagine if you made $50,000 a year but owed $50,000 on credit cards, and every year you're adding more debt faster than your income is growing. Eventually, something has to break. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, a nonpartisan watchdog organization, put it bluntly in their Thursday report. The United States is deeply indebted, and its finances are on an unsustainable long-term trajectory. While they acknowledge it's impossible to know exactly when disaster will strike, they warn that some form of crisis is almost inevitable, without major policy changes. So what could this crisis actually look like? The CRFB has identified 6 distinct scenarios, and here's the terrifying part. We could experience multiple crises simultaneously. Let me walk you through each one, from bad to catastrophic. The first scenario is what they call an austerity crisis, and this one could trigger the worst economic collapse since the Great Depression. Here's how it would unfold. Investors lose confidence in America's ability to pay its debts. In a panic, lawmakers are forced to implement massive, abrupt spending cuts or tax increases to calm the markets. The CRFB estimates that a fiscal contraction of just 5% of GDP could turn modest economic growth into a 3% economic contraction. That would be deeper than any recession we've seen since 1950. We're talking about unemployment spiking dramatically, businesses closing en masse, and a self-reinforcing downward spiral into depression. Sound far-fetched? It's already happened to developed nations in our lifetime. The report points to Greece in the 2010s as a cautionary tale. During the Great Recession, Greece faced an untenable spike in borrowing costs. The austerity measures imposed to deal with it decimated their economy and pushed unemployment to record levels. Yanis Varoufakis, who was Greece's finance minister during this crisis and resigned in protest over the austerity measures, has warned about what he calls a depressed society and even techno-feudalism emerging from such economic collapses. Portugal and Spain experienced similar, though less severe, crises during the same period. The difference? Those were smaller economies. If the United States, the world's largest economy and holder of the global reserve currency, experiences an austerity crisis, the global implications would be unprecedented. The second scenario is a full-blown financial crisis triggered by a collapse in confidence in U.S. Treasury bonds. Here's the nightmare scenario. If investors lose faith in America's creditworthiness, interest rates could spike uncontrollably. This would immediately devalue existing Treasury bonds, potentially triggering cascading failures throughout the banking system. The report points to the 2023 collapse of Silicon Valley Bank as a small-scale preview of how rapid rate increases can destabilize financial institutions. But they also reference 2007-2008 as the model for what a true financial crisis looks like. During the global financial crisis, hundreds of financial institutions closed, housing values declined by 1/4, economic output shrank 4%, and unemployment rose to 10%. It took years for the economy to recover. The CRFB notes that fiscal irresponsibility has contributed to financial crises several times around the world, citing Argentina in 1998, Greece and other European countries around 2009, and Brazil in 2016. The report includes a sobering warning. While financial markets appear able to bear current levels of U.S. debt, markets are rarely predictable, and investor confidence can shift quickly. In other words, everything might seem fine, until suddenly it's not. The third scenario might sound familiar to anyone who remembers recent inflation pain, but this would be far, far worse. In an inflation crisis, the Federal Reserve faces an impossible choice: allow banks to fail and the government to default, or print massive amounts of money to buy treasury bonds and keep the system afloat. If the Fed chooses the latter, what economists call monetizing the debt. It could spark spiraling, uncontrollable inflation that erodes everyone's savings and purchasing power. Think this is theoretical. History is full of examples. The report references Argentina's repeated inflation crises and the infamous Weimar Republic hyperinflation in 1920s Germany, where people needed wheelbarrows of cash to buy bread. Billionaire hedge fund manager Ray Dalio has been consistently warning about exactly this scenario. Speaking from Davos this week, Dalio described what he sees as the breakdown of the monetary order and posed the grim choice facing America. Do you print money, or do you let a debt crisis happen? In this scenario, your retirement savings, your paycheck, your bank account, everything denominated in dollars, would lose value rapidly. The middle class would be effectively wiped out. The fourth scenario is a currency crisis, and this one strikes at the heart of American global power. In this scenario, reckless fiscal policy leads to a sudden, dramatic depreciation of the US dollar. More critically, it could undermine the dollar's status as the world's dominant reserve currency. Why does this matter? The dollar's reserve currency status is one of America's greatest geopolitical advantages. It allows the US to borrow cheaply, gives American banks enormous influence, and essentially exports inflation to other countries. If that status erodes, the consequences would be profound. Imports would become significantly more expensive for Americans. Everything from electronics to clothing to food. Your purchasing power at the grocery store would plummet. But beyond consumer prices, America's geopolitical power would be fundamentally weakened. The ability to impose sanctions, influence global trade, and project power through financial systems would diminish dramatically. China has been working for years to challenge dollar dominance. A US-triggered currency crisis would hand them that opportunity on a silver platter. The fifth scenario is what the CRFB calls very unlikely, but also catastrophic: an actual default on US debt. Currently, the U.S. owes approximately $31 trillion to public debt holders, everyone from foreign governments to pension funds to individual investors. If the United States failed to pay interest or principal on this debt, either through political dysfunction or genuine inability to pay, the consequences would be apocalyptic. Global credit markets would freeze instantly, stock markets worldwide would crash, the global economy would likely plunge into a deep recession, possibly a depression. The report notes that numerous countries have defaulted throughout history: Mexico, Brazil, Peru, Argentina in Latin America, and Russia in the late 1990s. Argentina is still dealing with the aftermath of its default decades later, having just taken a controversial $20 billion credit line from the US in 2025, though it repaid it quickly. But here's the critical difference. None of those countries issue the world's reserve currency. None of them are the cornerstone of the global financial system. A US default would be in a category all its own. While the CRFB considers this scenario unlikely, they're not ruling it out, especially given recent political brinkmanship over the debt ceiling. The sixth and perhaps most insidious scenario is what they call the gradual crisis. This isn't a sudden collapse or market panic. Instead, it's a slow, grinding decline that unfolds over decades. In this scenario, high debt levels crowd out productive investment, growth slows, living standards stagnate, opportunity diminishes, but there's no single dramatic moment that forces change. The Congressional Budget Office models suggest that if we stay on this trajectory, real income per person could be 8% lower by 2050 than it would otherwise be. That might not sound dramatic, but think about what it means. An entire generation of Americans who will be meaningfully poorer than they should have been, with fewer opportunities and a lower quality of life. The classic example? Japan. The CRFB notes that Japan has sustained extremely high debt levels for several decades. They've avoided an acute crisis, but at what cost? Real GDP has grown only 10% over the past 2 decades. That's just 0.5% per year. That's an entire lost generation of economic growth. Albert Edwards, a prominent global strategist at Société Générale who describes himself as a perma-bear, has long advocated what he calls an ice age theory, that every developed country could suffer a fate similar to Japan's. Edwards told Fortune last November that this pattern has been building for 25 years, ever since the Fed began throwing money at problems through quantitative easing after the dot-com bubble burst. The CRFB also points to Western European economies like France and the UK as exhibiting signs of a gradual crisis: slow growth, inflexible fiscal policy, driven partly by high borrowing costs. In many ways, this gradual scenario might be the worst because it's the hardest to fight against. There's no crisis moment that forces action, just a slow erosion of prosperity and opportunity. So when could one of these crises hit? The unsettling answer is potentially at any time from multiple triggers. The CRFB identifies several possible catalysts. First, a recession. Economic downturns increase government spending on safety net programs while decreasing tax revenue, rapidly worsening the debt picture. Second, a poor treasury auction where demand for U.S. debt suddenly falters. If one of these regular auctions fails to attract enough buyers, it could trigger immediate panic in financial markets. Third, a breach of the debt limit. We've seen political brinkmanship over the debt ceiling repeatedly in recent years. If Congress actually fails to raise it and the U.S. misses payments, the crisis would begin immediately. Fourth, an external shock, another pandemic, a major war, a cyber attack on financial infrastructure. Any of these could be the spark that ignites the crisis. The report emphasizes that there's no single tipping point. It's more like we're sitting on top of a powder keg, and multiple different matches could set it off. Even without a crisis, the current situation is already deteriorating rapidly. Interest costs on the debt surged to roughly $1 trillion last year. Let me repeat that. We're now spending $1 trillion just on interest payments. That represents nearly 18% of all federal revenue, comparable to the entire Medicare budget. We're spending as much on interest as we spend on Medicare. Think about that. Nearly 1/5 of every tax dollar collected goes just to paying interest on past borrowing. Not building infrastructure, not funding education, not strengthening defense, just servicing debt. The report makes a critical point. With debt at 100% of GDP, the U.S. has less fiscal space than any time in history in case of another war, pandemic, or recession. In other words, if another major crisis hits, and history suggests one eventually will, we have far less capacity to respond than we did during past emergencies. During the 2008 financial crisis, the government had room to borrow and spend aggressively to stabilize the economy. During COVID-19, despite already elevated debt, we still had some fiscal capacity to respond. Next time? That cushion is largely gone. You might be thinking, we've heard debt warnings before, and nothing happened. Why should this be different? It's a fair question. Deficit hawks have been crying wolf for decades, but several factors make this moment genuinely different. First, we've actually hit the 100% debt to GDP threshold. This isn't a projection anymore. We're there. Second, interest rates have normalized after years of artificially low rates. This means debt service costs are skyrocketing, consuming an ever larger share of the budget. Third, demographic trends are worsening. As baby boomers retire, Social Security and Medicare costs are surging while the working-age population that funds these programs is growing more slowly. Fourth, political polarization has made fiscal reform nearly impossible. Both parties have essentially given up on deficit reduction, with Republicans opposing tax increases and Democrats opposing spending cuts. Fifth, the global context has changed. China is actively working to reduce dollar dependence. America's geopolitical competitors would benefit from a U.S. fiscal crisis. This combination of factors, high debt, rising interest costs, demographic pressures, political paralysis, and a changing global order, creates a genuinely unprecedented situation. So what would it take to avoid these crisis scenarios? The CRFB calls for what they describe as a thoughtful, pro-growth deficit reduction package. That's policy speak for a grand bargain that would need to include some combination of spending cuts, likely including reforms to entitlement programs like Social Security and Medicare, which are the largest drivers of future spending growth. Revenue increases, whether through tax reform, closing loopholes, or raising rates on some taxpayers. Pro-growth policies that accelerate economic expansion, which would increase revenue and make the debt more manageable relative to GDP. The political reality? This kind of comprehensive reform seems almost impossible in the current environment. Republicans generally oppose any tax increases. Democrats generally oppose any cuts to social programs, and neither party has shown much appetite for the kind of difficult choices required. Meanwhile, the clock is ticking, and the debt keeps growing. It's crucial to understand that an American fiscal crisis wouldn't stay in America. The U.S. dollar underpins global finance. U.S. Treasury bonds are considered the safest asset in the world and serve as the foundation for countless financial transactions. If confidence in U.S. debt wavers, the ripple effects would be immediate and global. Foreign governments hold trillions in U.S. debt. Their reserves would lose value. International trade predominantly occurs in dollars. That system could be disrupted. Global financial institutions with dollar-denominated assets would face losses. Developing countries that borrow in dollars would face crushing debt burdens as the currency fluctuates. The report notes that any American fiscal crisis would substantially reduce living standards for Americans and people across the world. This is why international observers are watching U.S. fiscal policy with increasing alarm. Perhaps the most frustrating aspect of this situation is that every year we delay makes the problem worse. The longer we wait to address the debt trajectory, the more painful the eventual solution becomes. It's like ignoring a small leak in your roof until the entire ceiling collapses. The repair costs exponentially more. Current policymakers face a political incentive to avoid tough choices. Spending cuts and tax increases are unpopular. It's much easier to kick the can down the road and let future politicians deal with the consequences. But the CRFB's report makes clear that strategy has an expiration date. At some point, and we don't know when, markets will force a reckoning. The question is whether we'll address this on our own terms, with careful planning and gradual adjustments, or whether we'll be forced into crisis mode with emergency measures that cause far more pain. Let's bring this all together with the critical points you need to understand. The U.S. national debt has hit 100% of GDP for the first time in modern history, with approximately $38 trillion owed and growing faster than the economy. A nonpartisan fiscal watchdog warns that some form of crisis is almost inevitable, without major policy changes. Not maybe, not might happen, but almost inevitable. 6 distinct crisis scenarios have been identified. An austerity crisis that could trigger depression-level economic collapse, a financial crisis that could cascade through the banking system, an inflation crisis that could erode everyone's savings, a currency crisis that could end dollar dominance, a default crisis that would be globally catastrophic, or a gradual crisis that slowly erodes prosperity over decades. We're already feeling the pain. $1 trillion in annual interest payments consuming 18% of federal revenue, as much as the entire Medicare budget. America has less fiscal capacity to respond to future emergencies than at any point in modern history. Multiple triggers could spark a crisis at any time: a recession, a failed treasury auction, a debt ceiling breach, or an external shock. Political gridlock makes comprehensive reform extremely difficult, while the problem grows worse each year we delay. The global implications would be severe, affecting living standards worldwide, not just in America. Here's the bottom line: this isn't abstract economics anymore. This is about the fundamental sustainability of the American economic model and our position in the world. The CRFB has laid out 6 different ways this could go wrong. The optimistic interpretation is that we still have time to choose a better path, but that window is closing. The pessimistic interpretation is that we're already past the point of no return, and we're just waiting to see which crisis scenario, or combination of scenarios, will be the one we actually experience. What's certain is that ignoring this problem won't make it go away. The $38 trillion question is whether America's political system can rise to the challenge before the markets force their own solution. That's the complete breakdown of America's debt crisis and the 6 catastrophic scenarios we could be facing. This is arguably the most important economic story that isn't getting enough attention. What do you think? Are we headed for inevitable crisis, or can America's economy grow its way out of this problem? Let us know in the comments and subscribe for more in-depth analysis on the economic forces shaping our future. Because one way or another, this debt trajectory will define the next generation of American.